Yeah, that works. Good afternoon. To those of you here in this room and the many that are watching on the live stream, we're so happy that you're here with us at St. Luke's. We get to launch today the beginning of our Ebenezer St. Luke's Forum series. They're going to have a couple of them throughout the year, and we are so pleased that Lisa Sharon Harper is with us as our first forum guests. John Vaughn and I, when we were putting the list together, her name popped up immediately as the person, before we knew about this book, as the person that had to kick this off. And you will find out very soon why. If you've had a chance to find this book, which isn't available yet, you'll know exactly why. Because she narrates through the story of her own life and her family, what we are trying to understand and what we're beginning to reckon with in this generation as the impact of systemic racism in this country. So we'll hear a lot more about that today, but we were excited the way that we described that before is the civil rights movement moving into the movement of human rights and what the work is for today, the unfinished work of the civil rights movement. And we have this gorgeous book that we get to introduce to all of you and that you get to buy 2 days before it actually launches. You're welcome. We're really glad to be able to offer that to you if you're here in person. I'd buy as many copies as you can and then order a bunch online if I were you. If you're remote, I'm really sorry. Please just order them online. And then I don't need to introduce, but I will. I'm new to Georgia, so I'm in Atlanta, so I'm very self-conscious about doing this, but one of your senators is here with us.
Hello, everybody. My classmate.
Right, so my claim to fame is when I was a student at Union, I happened to be a student at the same time that Raphael Warnock was doing his PhD, and he was a remarkable person at the time. And I have an Episcopal joke for those of you in this room. I remember sitting in the pit at Union working on something, as we all did, which was a public space when we wanted to study and not fall asleep. You're held accountable, you're sitting in the pit, working on your computer. Raphael Warnock comes by. It must have been a Sunday afternoon or something like that, and he says, "Hey, Winnie, you're an Episcopalian." I said, "Yeah, I am." He said, "I was just invited to preach at an Episcopal church." I was like, "Oh, they must have loved you. That would have been so exciting for them." He's like, "I don't know. I did what I usually do, and they just sat there." And I was like, "Well, that means you're great. That's what we do." So, yeah. So that's my Raphael Warnock story. That's my one claim to connection. So let me tell you a little bit about Lisa Sharon Harper. Lisa Sharon Harper is the founder of Freedom Road. So again, if you've got access to a computer, look that up. It's a beautiful, the campaign around that is beautiful. It's a consulting group dedicated to shrinking the narrative gap. She's a sought-after speaker, trainer, and consultant. She's written several books, including the critically acclaimed The Very Good Gospel, How Everything Wrong Can Be Made Right. Lisa previously served as Chief Church Engagement Officer at Sojourners, the publication that many of you here read, where she mobilized the church to engage campaigns on immigration reform and racial justice. She has researched her family's origins for 3 decades, for 30 years, and presented on her ancestors' achievements at the African American Civil War Museum. She is a citizen of Philadelphia and is in the same neighborhood where 3 generations of her ancestors have lived. I got to know Lisa a little bit when I lived in New York and was a chaplain at Columbia when I was at Trinity, as she was initiating, I think, some of the most creative projects, frankly, I heard of my time there about, do you remember the pilgrimage, the Ruby Woo pilgrimage? Bringing women of color together to journey through the stories and kind of walk the walk of women who had walked to freedom, right?
That's right.
Mark those places. So a beautiful and creative thinker that we have the privilege of having with us. We get to have a conversation. So we're going to ask some questions, and we're going to stop ourselves at some point and invite you to include your questions as well. And the way that we're going to do that, these COVID times, is there are some cards If you've got something to write with, write down what you're thinking about. And Mark Simmons is in the room somewhere. He's always in the room here. And he's going to get those cards to John Vaughn, who's right here, who has a microphone. And that's how we're going to get your voice into this conversation. I think that's what I have to do to introduce us.
Great.
Right? Great. And I'm going to sit down too.
Wow.
All right. While those cards are being passed out, can we start with a prayer? Yeah? Let us pray. Be known to us, God who has always been in these lands. God of all the people who have made their home in this place. God of our history. God who knows our future. Make us brave to speak your truth, to know your truths, to hear your prophets, to be your witness. We give thanks for Lisa Sharon Harper, the abundant blessings that flow from her to us, for the labor that has created this text, for the family that has created her. May our hearts and ears be open to hear what she brings to us. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
All right. We want to talk about this book.
Yes, we do.
So, why'd you say yes to this invitation? What brings you here?
What brings me here? This brings me here. So excited
Yep.
It drops in 2 days, y'all. So you got to get it. I mean, it really has been 30 years of my life researching what's here. And it's funny because when I started the research, of course, I wasn't thinking about writing a book. I hadn't written anything yet. And I just wanted to know, who am I as an African-American woman? Up to that point, and that was 1991 when we first started doing research on the family, up to that point, I could only go back as far as my grandparents. And I knew my grandmother, my great-grandmother, briefly, but I knew no other great-grandparents besides that one great-grandmom. And I didn't really know anything about her, except for the fact that she was old, you know. But I knew Kizzy, and I knew Kunta Kinte, and I knew everybody from Roots, and they were my family by proxy because I had soaked in that story. So in 1991, I got on the phone and I asked my mom, I said, Mom, I want you to tell me all you know about about your line, especially about your father's line, because I was really wanting to know, who is this Henry Lawrence person? And when you read the book, you're going to find out I still haven't figured it fully out. And that is intentional on the part of the government. The government obliterated identity and did that intentionally in order to control us. And it comes out really clearly in Henry's story. But when I began to realize that there were people in my line who were free before the Civil War, including Henry actually, but especially on the Fortune line, I said, wait a minute, well, how did this happen? How are their names on the census before the Civil War? Because everybody else, we just thought, we're going to have to go look at a slave schedule and find and try to match the ages and the times. But Philip Fortune, my great-grandfather, was on the census before the Civil War. And so that led us on a search, and it led us to Fortune Game McGee. Fortune Game McGee lived and walked and breathed and loved and suffered on this soil that we call American soil in 1687 in Maryland.
Wow.
And she was born to a Senegalese man and an Ulster Scot woman.
Oh, interesting.
Who fell in love and had a child. It was an affair because she was already married. And his name was George McGee. And so at the age of 18, Fortune was dragged to court and forced to be indentured until the age of 31 because of the rollout of this first race law in Maryland. And it was all focused on what do we do with these mixed race children that are happening, because white women were marrying enslaved black men at an astronomical rates and having children by them in Maryland. That was the issue in Maryland.
In the early 1700s.
In the early 1600s, in the late 1600s.
1600s.
Yeah, because Maudlin McGee came, and she came to Maryland, Somerset County, 1682, and Sambo Game, that was Fortune's father's name. By the way, Sambo was his original name in Senegal, and it means second son.
Oh, wow.
That's something else. And it turns out there were lots of Sambos because there were lots of second sons. And it was only after the Civil War and during the post-Reconstruction era that propaganda was propagated throughout the country that denigrated the name Sambo. But until that time, it simply meant second son. So Sambo was brought on a slave ship in 1686. So sometime in that year, they met, fell in love, and had that affair, and then they named their child Fortune. So I will talk. I'm going to stop for a minute, let you talk, and ask a question. But at one point, I definitely have to talk with you about the very first race law. I want to share that. Should I just go into it?
I think you should. Yeah,
just go into it.
I want to
Okay,
know.
here we go.
Yeah.
All right. So I just don't want to blab, blab, blab. So the very first race law in Virginia was 1662. 1662. The legislature, which is the House of Burgess, looks around, and they get, they're starting to get nervous because they're seeing all of their people, not all, but many of their enslaved people win their freedom in court. Why are they winning their freedom in court? Because a girl named Elizabeth Key took her case to court in 1650. Elizabeth Key was the daughter of Thomas Key, who at one point was actually a legislator. He was a member of the House of Burgesses. He was her father. He was a British citizen. British citizenship went through the line of the father, and this was a British colony. And so she said, wait a minute, my father is a British citizen. Another law under British law was that you could not enslave another British citizen. So that means, wait, my father is a British citizen, therefore I am a British citizen, and you're enslaving me? No, you can't enslave me. I need to be set free. Oh, and by the way, I was baptized, and you're not supposed to be able to enslave another Christian either. So she took this to court and won. She won her case in 1650. Okay, 1650. Well, there were a stream of other cases that came after her. So 12 years later, 1662, the House of Burgesses, they had a choice. They could have phased out slavery at this point. They could have said, you know what, we have so many mixed race kids, and they're all winning their kids. We could have they could have gone to injustice light, just had the indenture, let's just do indenture here. Or they could have done justice light. They could have said, we're going to actually phase everything into work, like pay for work. No, they changed where you get citizen status from. No longer would it come through the father, which is English law. Now they declared we are now hereby going to go through the Roman law of partis, which is the line of the mother. And then they added two words that created race-based slavery: in perpetuity. So the mothers, if your ancestor reached back to a black woman, then you would be enslaved, not indentured. And that's your identity now. Well, 2 years later, in 1664, in Maryland, they recognized they were having a perceived problem on the ground. Because something else I realized in this research is law never happens because people think that it's just a good idea, right? Or this is the way we should be living. No, it's because they're trying to solve a problem on the ground. Am I right? Right? Right. So, look, we got the person right here. So a lawmaker. And so the problem that they perceived, Raphael, was that these white women were marrying and having children by enslaved black men. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little confused. And so they decided this was going to be the law. So get this, white men, I want you to listen to this more than anybody else. You need to know the law that you passed, okay? You said, if a white woman becomes or decides to marry an enslaved black man and has children by that man, then she herself will become enslaved to her husband's master until her husband dies. And her children will be enslaved in perpetuity.
Wow.
So, hello. I was like, what? So it tells you a lot, doesn't it? It tells you about the value of white women to white men. It tells you two other things. It tells you about the white male ego, because they were really threatened by the fact that they were marrying black men. But also it tells you about the value of the dollar. Because a few years later, they look up the same legislature, the General Assembly in Maryland, the colony of Maryland, and they say, look what's happening. Planters are now forcing their Ulster, Scot, and Irish indentured women to marry enslaved African men and have children by them, because it creates a free labor force in perpetuity in this Catholic colony. Wow. And so they said, ooh, they clutched their pearls, and they said, okay, we got to change this. So they put the keys to indenture in the hands of the church instead of in the hands of the planter. And now the church becomes the arbiter of who gets enslaved and who gets indentured. And they become the record keepers, better record keepers even than the courts. And it was the Episcopal Church that had that role in Maryland for the bulk of the role, the entire colonial period until the Revolutionary War.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow, right? And Fortune was born 23 years after that. And it was that series of laws that ensnared her in indenture, because by the time she got indentured, the law had changed, because they kind of backed off of the enslaved white women thing. And instead, it said, if your ancestor goes back to a white woman, you cannot be enslaved, but you can be indentured. But if they had a union with a black man, you would be indentured. Or no, something like that.
Wait, and what was the material difference between indenture and enslavement at that time?
It's only the time limit that you have. You
It's
have
your
a
lifetime.
time limit.
Yeah.
So indenture. Let me say that again. I think I got that confused. If it goes back to a white woman, you could not be enslaved. That's what it was. If it goes back to a white woman, you could not be enslaved. If it goes to a black man, you would be indentured. Like, there's just no option of not being indentured if it's a black man. You get that what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So if it's a white man, we'll see.
A lot here.
I got to take a lot in. Yeah.
This is complicated.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
Well,
Yes, please.
It's great to be here at St. Luke's Episcopal Church, and I am glad that Ebenezer and St. Luke's, is that the Lord call it?
Yeah, because the phones are off. So that's, yeah.
Better answer if it's the Lord. I am grateful that St. Luke's and Ebenezer Church are doing this. And so give yourselves a round of applause for being here.
It's a big deal.
It is a big deal.
I'm so grateful to be here with your rector and my classmate from Union Seminary, and grateful to be here with Lisa Sharon Harper, who with me has been is a fellow at the Auburn Theological Seminary. We're senior fellows. So let's a lot here,
Yeah.
a lot to think
yeah.
about. A couple things I'm struck by just in that part of the discourse. Number one, the ways in which the church, from the beginning,
From the beginning.
has participated and facilitated the original sin in the New World. Of course, actually the original sin is the genocidal of Native Americans.
Yeah.
But this whole issue around race and slavery, the ways in which we've been wrestling with this pandemic that keeps mutating, COVID-16, 19. And folks had to make stuff up to work it out. And so, as you were talking, it brought me back to some research that I did for my book. I won't name because we push your book today.
Okay.
But literally I'm remembering that the lower house of Maryland actually asked the upper house to pass a law. And that law was centered around baptism.
Yes, that's right.
So part of the issue was that there was always this sneaking suspicion that if you baptized these enslaved Africans, you might have to liberate them.
That's right.
Like they were wrestling with that from the beginning. In fact, early on there was resistance to making slaves Christian. Initially there was resistance to that. And it was because of this concern that if they became first of all, what about humanity? Let's start there. But if they were your Christian sisters and brothers, then that created a real conundrum. And so this issue was then corrected, codified in secular law and church canon law, both. So the lower house asked the upper house to pass a law to explicitly clarify this issue that baptism does not make you free.
That's right.
They put that in law, secular law. And the Bishop of London said that not only does becoming a Christian not make you free, he said it actually puts you under a stronger obligation so that you serve now to the glory of God. And so they baptized the enslavement of other human beings. So that's an interesting place for us to start the conversation as we talk about the legacy of oppression, not just slavery, but human oppression in general.
Yeah.
But slavery could not have lasted so long were it not for the church. And I think that's something for us Christians to wrestle with. Segregation, Jim Crow segregation and slavery could not have lasted so long were it not for the active participation and support of the church that kept the records, canonized it, baptized it in church doctrine. That's the other piece. First piece. Second piece is I'm struck by the way in which race really is a construct.
Yes, that's the thing.
And the implications are real, but the thing itself is completely made up. Race is not a biological fact.
That's right.
It's a social construct.
It's a political construct.
And so they're sitting there trying to figure it all out. And you see, literally, and then it's a political construct, and it shows up differently in different contexts. It looks different in Haiti.
That's right.
It looks different in apartheid South Africa. Here you just light skinned. Somewhere else you're a colored, which means
That's
something
right.
different.
That's right.
It's a construct. And to think about the tragic implications of something that's completely made up. God made us and we just make stuff up. And the implications, the tragic implications are so far reaching. So I'm glad we're here. And this is something for us to think through and work at honestly and lovingly. Thank you for this.
Wow.
This is amazing, right?
Yeah.
This thank you.
Yeah. Well, and Pastor Warnock, you said without the church, right? We don't get slavery, we don't get racism the way we have it without the permission and complicity of the church, which is very generous, actually, without the complicity and the active intervention of particular churches, not the entire church, right? And we are sitting in an Episcopal church right now. The Bishop of London is the Anglican Bishop of London, right? The established colony of Georgia was Anglican. Like this is our legacy in particular.
Wow.
This is not a vague thing connected to people who follow Jesus. This is very specifically our legacy.
Can
And
I
we need to note that.
add something? George McGee, Maudlin's husband, eventually moves south. They go south through North Carolina, South Carolina, down into Georgia. And they become some of the most, and they change their last name from Muggy to McGee in order to blend in with the Irish here. Because of the contentious relationship between the Ulster Scots and the Irish. They didn't want to get found out. And they become some of the most prolific slaveholders in the South.
Wow.
Georgia, Alabama, all the way to Texas.
The McGees.
The McGees, yeah.
McGees. So here's my question for you. You have spent 30 years discovering this history. So I know, when I think of you as an evangelical, a woman of faith,
I know,
who
right?
writes about social justice, right? Tell me about that journey that takes you to this place.
Well, that's chapter 7.
Okay.
She won't do it of fortune.
There we are. How race broke my family and the world, and how to repair it all. Oh, there you go. There you go. So that is chapter 7. You know, each chapter goes into the story of one of my family members, and it goes through the generations till you end up at me at the end of part 2 of the book. And then part 3 gets into 3 essays on how to repair what race broke in the world. But this question of how did I, because it's a really interesting journey. My faith was born in 1983. I walked down an aisle at a Sunday evening camp church meeting at a revival in an all-white area, and I was the only piece of pepper in a bowl of salt on that night. But it was August. I even checked the calendar to make sure, and it's true. August 21st, 1983, around 9:30 at night, at a campground in Cape May, New Jersey. And I walked forward because my friend tapped me on the shoulder and said, would you go up with me? And I had been trying to figure out, should I go? I haven't gone. I've been sitting through these things for a whole year, investigating this person named Jesus, and I've done sing-a-thons for Jesus. I've done walk-a-thons for Jesus. I must be a Christian by now. And so, but she tapped me, and so I said, okay, I'll go. So I went up, and we knelt at the wooden altar, and she started to weep. And I thought she was already a Christian. So I was like, what are you weeping for? And then all of a sudden, I started to weep. And I was like, why am I weeping? But all of a sudden, all the old ladies, they all, white-haired old ladies, they surrounded us, and I just lost it. And it really did feel like something lifted. Something literally, I felt like I did. I felt like there's a me before that moment, and there's a me after that moment. It really is. And I remember asking myself on the way home, which was literally 2 minutes away, it was around the corner, but asking myself that night, I wonder if I'm going to be a Christian 5 years from now. Well, that was 1983. 1983 was also the year that Reagan was running for president for his second term. And it was the year that Bob Jones University lost its fight in the Supreme Court because it was fighting because it lost its tax exemption because it refused to desegregate. Now, that fight began mid-1970s, like 1973 and forward. And the people who came and joined in on that fight were people like Jim Baker, Buchanan, Paul Weyrich, who was the founder of the Heritage Foundation, and others. And so they were the ones who were behind Bob Jones's push to maintain pure white space. Bob Jones University tried, like, I don't know what, to maintain that pure white space. Their first acquiescence was to say, okay, you're saying you're going to take away our tax-exempt status because we are going against the title in the Civil Rights Act, which is founded on the Brown versus the Board of Education. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to admit one black student. So they admitted their custodian as a student for one, and he made it for less than a year. He said, I'm out. I'm not doing this, right? So then there was the IRS came back and said, that's not good enough. So they said, okay. So you know what we're going to do now is we're going to allow black students to come in, but only if they're married.
Wow.
So it goes right back to 1662
Wow.
and 1664, right? Only if they're married. And then IRS said, that's not good enough. So they said, okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to allow single black students to come in, but only if they sign an agreement that they will not date while they are on campus. I swear to you. And in a church, I'm swearing, sorry. But I swear. And white students had to sign an agreement that they would not date, nor would they be sympathizers with the misogynization of the races. If they were sympathizers, they would be expelled. And so they lost their court case. They lost their Supreme Court case in 1983. So in 1983, they lose their Supreme Court case, and within weeks, it is announced that the moral majority is born. And Paul Weyrich confided in a group of religious right leaders in 1991 when they all gathered kind of as a reunion of, like, the best of days, like of the people who started the religious right. And somebody in the room, this is all documented actually in several places. Randall Balmer has documented it a lot in several different books, and most, I would actually point to his last book, Bad Faith, because I think he's done a lot more thinking that's crystallized it. But he says that in 1991 they came together and somebody in the room said, oh yeah, abortion was the thing that launched the religious right. And Paul Weyrich, founder of the Heritage Foundation, said, oh no, it didn't. Bob Jones University launched the religious right. Bob Jones University. It was because Bob Jones University, that was a direct resistance to the gains that were made by Dr. King and the movement.
Yep.
That happened less than a decade after King's assassination. In those 10 years, most of the schools in the South still were not desegregated. They were being desegregated throughout the 60s and 70s. And it was in that context, the same people who were on the front lines of the segregation movement became the leaders of the religious right. But they realized in 1983, since they had just lost that Supreme Court case, and I was saying this a while ago, and Randall Balmer would never go there, but in Bad Faith, which he wrote in the light of the election of Donald Trump, he says, you know what, I'm there, I agree. They turned and they saw that they could no longer protect their white male supremacy through direct means of, arguing the problem of race or arguing for racial purity. So they decided to argue for domination over women with the abortion. Abortion became the flag, and it was a very, very potent flag. Yeah. But they had the same tactic. They needed to overturn the calculus of the Supreme Court in order to ultimately overturn Brown v. Board of Education, because that's the goal.
It's abortion and sexuality.
And sexuality,
right?
yes,
Yeah.
yes, exactly.
Just, again, for the Episcopalians watching, there is a clear through line from that moment to the Institute for Religion and Democracy, which led to the divisions in the Episcopal Church, which same, like we did gender and sexuality,
Absolutely.
but it really comes from the civil rights movement for us, and ACNA, like the divisions in our church and the struggles in our church clear through line from the same moment.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, so what we're fighting right now, so we get to January 6th, right? And we're all going, how did this happen? What is this? Well, what this is 30 years of the religious right, building infrastructure and message, and I mean, like an army staying on message, and having one goal the whole time: overturn the Supreme Court. Overturn the Supreme Court so that they could get, and by that, what I mean is get a majority conservative Supreme Court. Because, and this came to me actually as we were arguing the Brett Kavanaugh case, I began to ask some legal scholars, has there ever been a moment in the history of the Supreme Court when we have had a majority conservative ruling that protected the rights of people of color? And they all came back saying, I never really thought about that. No. So if you get that calculus, not only will you overturn Roe v. Wade, which likely will be overturned this year or next year, but you also get the overturning of affirmative action, which is about to happen, and ultimately Brown v. Board. And Brown v. Board is the only thing that stands between us and Plessy versus Ferguson. So that's why I wrote Fortune. Because we have to know how we got here. We have to know the choices that were made. Throughout our history, in every generation, we made choices. And we have the power to choose another way of living together in the world. But we will not make that choice. We will go the normal route if we do not understand how we got here. Yeah.
A lot here. So, to push you further on this, what is the distinction, if there is any? What's unique about this moment? Because
Oh, that's good.
because there are many of us who've been frustrated over the years and the decades with our Christian sisters and brothers who are on the right. And while we were out there fighting for voting rights, fighting for reproductive rights, fighting for worker rights, and the dignity of work, and the dignity of workers, we've been frustrated many times because they have been reticent at best, often hostile, but
Yeah.
reticent at best.
Yeah.
And those of us particularly who operate within the context of faith, while frustrated, say, well, they got a certain theology. I think it's not, that theology needs to be interrogated, right?
It does.
Because it's focused on the slavery of sin, to use some Pauline language, but not so much on the sin of slavery.
Hello now. That's true.
And so we've been frustrated because they've got, seems one or two ethical, privatistic issues that have to do with the bedroom, no concern about the sins in the boardroom, right? What they view as sin, right? No view of the boardroom. And we've been frustrated. And say, well, but that's their view. It's I think it's wrong-headed, because there are over 2,000 passages about how you treat the poor
Right. That's
in the
right.
Bible.
That's right.
Over 2,000.
Yep.
But we say, well, that's where they are. But then we get to this moment, and all of a sudden the family values folk
Hello. That's
line up behind somebody who, I don't know how many times he's been married. I'm just, I'm based on their values. And unrepentant about grabbing women by their private parts.
Yeah.
Just, you had to have a meter of how many times this person lies every time they open their mouth. And, you know, we can go on and on and on. So then you're like, well, what's going on? Because even if I concede that these are your issues, then you've supported this person. Right?
Oh, exactly.
So what's going on here?
Wow, that's a great. What's going on? That is the question, isn't it?
What's the religion?
Okay. So there's great research that's happening right now by the author of the book, one of the authors of the book, Divided by Faith, Michael Emerson. I just recently saw him speak. And so I'm going to talk with you about his book, ironically, right now. I wish that he had written it or had that speech before I finished this book, because I would have included it. But this is important to understand. He's a sociologist, and he used to be based out of Rice University in Texas, and now is up in Chicago. And he's been doing research on evangelicals for decades. His discovery, along with Christian Smith in the book Divided by Faith, was that the deepest divide in worldview in America exists inside the evangelical church. It's the divide between white evangelicals and black evangelicals. That there's no deeper divide in worldview in America than there. Isn't that deep? That's just deep. And I think it's because it's reactionary, right? They've gone to two polar opposites. So, but now he's doing this research, and he basically explicitly shared about a week ago with a group of white evangelicals, actually a multi-ethnic group, that the majority of white Christians, not just evangelicals, but the majority of white Christians in America, the highest concentration of which lives inside the white evangelical church. The majority of white mainline, the majority of white Catholic, and the majority of white evangelicals that are practicing, the people who go to church, and this was their measure, at least once a week. The majority of white Christians not only voted for Trump, but actually what he would call practicing white Christians, and the religion they're really practicing is the religion of white supremacy. That's their religion. And he says the religion has iconography.
So I'm new, so I shouldn't do this, but do you want to turn around and look behind you?
That's it. That's the iconography right there.
Yeah.
It is white Jesus.
Yeah.
White Jesus. And then also, ironically, the eagle.
Yeah. No, it's all yeah. It's all in
the
here.
eagle, and then usually the eagle with the flag and the cross. Those things come together. Those are the two major pieces. Those are the totems of this religion. It's the religion of white nationalism, white supremacy. And so the question you asked, such a great question. I think what's different about this moment is that it's been revealed. For the last 50 years, it was revealed in the South, right? Down in the civil rights movement. Y'all, there were fights. You had Bull Connor. I mean, that was part of Dr. King's strategy, was to bring light, shine light on what's going on, so that people could choose. They could make a choice, right? They could say, am I on the side of Bull Connor, or am I on the side of righteousness, of those people who the law is beating down? The choice was clear. But after the civil rights movement, it went underground. And it put on the mask of anti-abortion. And it put on the mask of trickle-down economics. Right? It put on all these masks, as I'm looking at people with masks. Right? What?
Yeah.
Yes.
The moralizing around work, meanwhile not supporting people who work every day, like the 600,000 Georgians who are in the Medicaid gap.
Wow. Hello.
Right.
Yes.
That's the working poor.
Yes, exactly.
Who can't get health care.
So it went underground. But Trump brought it back out to light. That's what's different about this moment. Because what happened was he actually crossed a line. He made a mistake as far as they're concerned, because they were able to get a lot of stuff done in the dark. But now people have to choose. I mean, the entire party, the entire GOP, minus 2 senators right now, are literally they are literally propagating white nationalism. They're literally doing what Dr. King said they would do. In 1967, he wrote, "Where do we go from here? Chaos or community?" And in that book, in the first chapter, you know what he said, right? He said, the segregationists, read white nationalists now, right? White Christian nationalists. The segregationist would rather have an American form of fascism than democracy, if democracy requires equality.
Wow.
He said that. He said that in 1967. And this is what we are seeing come to bear right now. They are choosing an American form of fascism when they are voting for voter suppression, when they are gerrymandering their districts, when they are scheming for voter subversion through the elector system. So what's different is that the whole thing, it's like you don't even need a Bull Connor. They're all Bull Connor. They're all Bull Connor right now. But we need to strategize for how to bring light to that in the public eye in the same way that the civil rights movement did. That's the next moment.
Well, and it's part of the struggle of this moment so in 1958, it was quite clear what our values were in walking down the streets of the city,
Wow,
right?
yeah.
And today, we have to do some interpretation, like what you're doing. And people have to believe us, right? And so you're trying to convince people that, frankly, that image means something. I'm sorry to pick on that image. It probably has a great story I don't know about, but that image means something. And in 1958, people absolutely knew what that image meant.
Oh, yeah.
Right? We might not talk about it. Everyone knew what that meant. Now, actually, you'd have to do some real work, right?
That's true.
In the same way that somehow we've gotten to a place where, what does the word moral mean in moral majority, right? Or in our baptismal covenant, dignity is a legal term. We use the term that we promise to support the dignity of every human being. That's not a theological term.
Wow.
That's a legal term.
Wow, yeah.
And yet, the majority of Episcopalians, as you said, right? That's a majority white church. We have somehow lost we've lost the meaning of the words themselves. Wow. Right?
Which means we really need to be in conversations like this, right? So that's part of it, is that we've been so divided. We've been so siloed in our own fiefdoms and fighting for scraps in our fiefdoms rather than being in conversation. Because the only way to bridge that gap is really the best, most potent way to bridge the gap is to share our stories with each other. That's part of the reason why I wrote the book in the form of stories for the first 2/3 of the book. It's not a normal way to write a book about race, actually, especially not in the church. People want to, what are your 4 points, you know what I mean? And what's the formula, and so, but no, we're going to start with fortune. And then we're going to talk about the Lawrences, and because until we soak in the stories, you really won't understand. You might know, but you won't understand. Yeah.
One of the things your book highlights for me is that the law happens to people, and people are defined by the law. So in my family, that's that my parents were born as subjects of the British Empire. Right? You think about it, that sounds awful, doesn't it? Wow. It sounds terrible, and it sounds like a long time ago. That is who they were on paper, right? And it makes it very clear what the subjugation of India was in that moment when I say they were born as subjects. Right, and that at Union, there's a collection of ephemera of pamphlets that were used during the 16th, 17th, 1800s to recruit missionaries. And you can see the language of race and racism as we have it today, and race develop over time as they try to decide what it is those missionaries are supposed to do in those colonies. It was designed for the church, like the church was developing the language. So we have defined ourselves legally, morally, right, theologically, in the last 100 years in ways that now feel to us permanent, indelible, neutral, sometimes, right?
Yeah.
But with a very particular agenda of just making a lot of money, right? There wasn't really much else behind it, or am I wrong about that?
No, you are not wrong. In fact, that makes me think of, I did some research on the origins of this concept called race. Like, why do we even think about race? And why do we think about race in the way we think about it? Well, you have to trace it all the way back to Plato. So, and it might go back further than there, but I haven't been able to trace one before him in Western civilization, right? And we even think, what is Western civilization? We kind of know it's basically those Europeans. So Plato, in 360 BC, pontificated in his Republic, the Republic, about what race is. And what Plato said that race is the metals that different people are made of. Some people are made of gold, others are made of copper, others are made of tin and silver. And by the way, lest you think you know the hierarchy in that, you don't, because they had different values to the Greek Empire, right, and the Roman Empire when he was writing, Greek Empire when he was writing. And so, but whatever their metal is, he said, determines how they will serve society, the Republic. So in the very beginning, race was conceived to order the polis, to order the Republic. Now, it did not take but 10 years for hierarchy to become clear. Plato's student, Aristotle, wrote his book, Politics, on politics. And On Politics, homeboy says this. He says, if you have been conquered, then you have demonstrated that you were created to be enslaved. And scholars understand that basically in his time, what he would have understood to be a full human being is to be white, like him, to be male, like him, and to be able-bodied, like him. So this is the seeds of the domination, the snowball of domination that goes throughout the Western Empire. I had a deep thought about a year ago. I asked myself, because I was about to speak for some folks, and I thought, okay, they're going to need this. When was the last time that people of European descent went anywhere in the world, speaking of colonization, went anywhere in the world and did not imagine to themselves, we should be ruling here. We would do a better job. Think about that. I mean, really, can you come up with the date? What was the date? I drew a blank. And then I remembered, it's before the Greek Empire. You have to go all the way back before the Greek Empire, because since the Greek Empire, wherever Europeans have gone, they have tried to conquer. Empire has been the project since then. Now, they didn't start empire for sure. We even see that in the Bible. It's like on page 14, right, or chapter 14. But what you see is that, look, I mean, in the game of colonization, Europe won, basically, right? So you won, so now you got to own it. And it's that project started 3,000 years ago. So that it gave me chills because it made me realize there's no common memory among people of European descent of not ruling. There's no common memory of not going into a space and not assuming rulership, not assuming supremacy, not assuming nobility and goodness and rightness. But because there was a start point, we know it's not inherent. We know people can choose differently. we can choose to live differently. So the question, I've actually come to think of it like this way, and we talked about this a few years ago. I don't really talk about it in terms of racism anymore. I don't think that's really helpful anymore. I do understand racialization of our nation, but I also understand it in the same way you just described, Raphael, Honorable Raphael. Sorry.
Mr. Senator, sir. Yeah.
The Honorable. Okay, so.
Just call me for lunch.
Just call me for lunch. I love it. So, but
Doesn't matter what you call me.
Thank you. I understand it in very similar ways to what you just described as well, that wherever colonization touched its talons, the first MO, the first modus operandi of controlling the people was to establish race, was to establish the hierarchy of human belonging according to race in that space. And whiteness means the same thing, though it looks differently everywhere. Whiteness is always the group that is called to rule. It's the same in Brazil. They actually have a white class in Brazil, but those white Brazilians, if they came here, would be Latino, right? Because that's how it works in our racial construct. But they're white, and then they have mocha, and then they have brown, and then they have black, and black is on the bottom. And every single one, black is on the bottom. And sorry.
If you really want to mess with it, just so everyone can laugh, guess what my birth certificate says?
What?
Yeah, I was born in Dallas, Texas in 1972. Anyone want to guess what race I am? On my birth certificate, I'm white.
White, yes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because Indian people fought their way all the way to the Supreme Court.
And lost,
And,
right?
and
I think we lost.
that was Pakistani. I think that. Did you lose?
Oh,
So
yeah.
how is it
Didn't
white?
lose.
Tell
Right.
me how it's white. That's interesting.
You tell me. I mean, I was born this color.
Winnie, tell us how you're white.
How are you white, girl? You ain't even like white by law, and they put that on
I
there.
was born in this. Yeah, I was born in this
That's
color,
deep.
as far as I know. Yeah, no, we lost. So there was an Indian man that fought, and it's interesting about it, right? Like
Yeah.
he fought to be classified as white because he had immigrated here during British colonialism, and to own land you had to be white, and that law
Yes.
was put into place either in his lifetime or his father's. So the law, all these laws are changing all the time. So he couldn't own land. And his strategy, because he was not white, he was Indian, right? Because white didn't exist. Like, what is white? As our children will tell us, who's white, right? People
Right.
are pink and beige and whatever. So he fought to be white so that he could be a landowner, and he lost. He didn't succeed. So that's not. So we never actually got classified.
That's right.
Some nurse filling out a form decided that my parents weren't black, which is interesting, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Decided my parents were not Mexican, because I'm from Texas. That was the other category.
Oh, wow.
And so decided that we were white. And the same thing happened to my brother, who's a little bit darker skinned than I am, which is how completely arbitrary the construct is.
Yes, exactly. That's such a great example. It's a great example. I think that when I think about this, the line goes from Plato to Aristotle, and then for me, it helps me to think of it this way. Then Aristotle, right? You just take a 1,000-year leap, and you get the Pope Nicholas V. And Pope Nicholas V was the guy who said to an explorer friend, a friend of the family, who was coming to him to say, hey, Pope, I'm going to go exploring. I need a blessing. And he goes, hey, I'll give you a blessing. All you need to do is, in fact, I'll even do you one better. If you land on some land and you see that this land is not civilized and not Christian, you get to claim the land for the throne and enslave its people. That's what he did. That's what he said. And that became Romanus Pontifex, and that became the doctrine of discovery, which is to this day embedded in our Constitution and in our laws. And in fact, even referenced by Supreme Court justices, both liberal and conservative. Yeah. Ruth Bader Ginsburg referenced the doctrine of discovery when ruling on a case of Native American sovereignty over land at one point. And so the doctrine of discovery, that's the point when it moves from philosophy, into the church. And that is the reason we have the world as we have it. And the Pope was not, this is Y'all, this for me is the crux of it. The Pope was not referencing the scripture. The Pope was referencing Aristotle. The Pope was saying, if you've been conquered, you have proven you were created to be enslaved.
As opposed to Paul, as opposed to Galatians, is that what you're saying?
As opposed to Galatians that says there is no Jew or Greek or slave or free or male or female. Yes. Or as opposed to the very first page of the whole Bible that says, and let them all be made in my image. Yeah. And let them all exercise dominion. Yeah. Hello. Yeah. And dominion meaning steward the land, exercise agency, make choices that impact the world. All of us were created for that. And by the way, last point, and then, we can move on to something else, but every single writer of the entire text, including the ones who wrote that text, was a brown person in the context of colonization or fear of it. Even David and Solomon were brown people who were in fear for their lives of being colonized. Jesus was born a brown man who the year he was born, there were 500 people per day were crucified the year he was born for a period of time by Roman centurions who came through town, a Roman general, and did that in order to squash a rebellion against Caesar, a white supremacist empire. So this book, this is my Bible, right? This, not upside down, I'm not Trump, there you go. So this book was written by brown people who were colonized. And the whole New Testament was written by brown people colonized by white people. And yet the locus of the place that tells us how we need to think about this text is in white empire, the halls of white empire in Germany and England and Switzerland. They're the ones who tell us what we think, what we should be thinking about this text and if we're off or not. I have just really seriously been coming to say, who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are that you who are from the halls of empire can interpret a brown colonized text for brown colonized people? That's how we get 1662. That's how we get 1664. That's how we get 1877 with the Compromise of 1877 that pulled the federal troops out of the South. And then we get the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan with the cross. That's how we get January 6th.
So, and I ask this for all of us, where do we go from here? What are the opportunities to build what Dr. King called beloved community? And
I would say, I'll speak for myself. My project right now, I am deep in a project. There's a whole movement called the deconstruction movement right now. I'm not with that movement. Because the deconstruction, now I understand the impetus for it. I really do. Because what that movement is rising out of people who are waking up to the fact that they've been duped. And now they're in a process of deconstructing the faith and the scripture and Jesus. But deconstruction itself sees the self as the center point, the axis around which the interpretation happens. I am for the decolonizing movement. I think that the work of the church for the next 500 years is to decolonize this text, to decolonize our read of it, to decolonize our churches, to decolonize the way we even interact with each other, the way that we organize ourselves. And what does that mean? It means actually a disaggregation of power, actually a democratization of power, so that, and also a shifting of power that really flows with the natural shift of the church right now. Because the church, the majority of the church are people of color around the world. Yeah. The majority church, the majority world is people of color. But the majority of church is people of color around the world. Post-colonizing peoples who are picking up this text, and they're finding liberation in it, especially if they have come to the text not within those white churches that are imposing their read on it. So I think that it's the work of the church now to decolonize, meaning we need to read it with each other. These kinds of gatherings are exactly what we need to be doing. But we also need to be opening up this text with each other and asking, what do you see? What do you see? Because unless you are reading the text with brown, colonized, or post-colonizing people, you're going to miss it. You're going to miss it. And that's one of the reasons why I think when we look at all the liberation movements, most of the major liberation movements that have happened in America, they have actually come from communities first that were brown and colonized. The abolitionist movement can trace its origins to the beginning of the black church. The black church exists itself. This is my own thing. I don't. You might disagree with me, but I contend it exists as protest. It doesn't just say protest is okay. It is protest.
All right, since the first sentence in my book, since you went there.
Okay. Name the book. You got to name the book.
The first sentence is the black church was born fighting for freedom.
Yes. Yes.
That is its raison d'etre. This independent freedom church movement establishing our own churches, denominations, not out of a segregationist impulse at all, but really to declare, to bear witness against segregation in God's house, where communion itself was segregated.
Exactly.
And to say that of one blood God has made all nations to dwell upon the face of the earth. So literally born in protest, born fighting for freedom, born saying that the gospel is both about the slavery of sin and the sin of slavery. The divided mind of the black church is the text. And Amazon, I'm just kidding.
That's great. That's funny. No, the divided mind of the church. You have to get that. I did get that book,
of the black
by the
church.
way.
Divided mind
of
of the black church.
Yeah. So it's a great book, y'all.
Well, and so if you all have questions in the room, John is up here, and we can get those questions to John. He's got a microphone. And I want to, while we get ready for that, John's figuring out what he's going to say. So you write about the move from civil rights to human rights, and I feel like so linked to this book that you're talking about, The Divided Mind of the Church, and again, think of my experience in India, a country that arguably is decolonial and becoming fascist in its nationalism, right? And what's missing in that is, I think, what you address is the commitment to human rights, and I think the church as well, in its liberative impulse, struggles, right, with the commitment to human rights. Can you say something about that move from civil rights to human rights?
Absolutely. There's a really great book about this called Eyes Off the Prize by Dr. Carol Anderson. Highly recommend it. When I was in grad school getting my master's in human rights, my professor said, you have to read this book. So I did. And what Dr. Carol Anderson illuminates is the reality that the civil rights movement began as a human rights movement. It began with the struggle for economic rights. One of the things that we failed to really take in, I was just talking to my Uber driver about this yesterday. Or maybe it was a limousine driver. Thank you for that, by the way.
Hey, only the best.
Only the best, right? So the reality that in 1959, when they first started charting poverty rates in America, 55% of African Americans were living below the poverty line. 55%. I mean, do you realize that in 2009, at the height of the economic downturn, white folk were threatening to jump out of windows because their poverty rate had reached, 12%? Really, literally, it's the end of the world. We were at 55% in 1959, and that was on the front end of the civil rights movement. So economic rights, the right not to be poor, was central to our struggle. And it also came at the same time, 1946, at the beginning of the UN. And so the UN was coming into being, and Eleanor Roosevelt was on the Charter Committee writing the charter. And so A. Philip Randolph took the case of African Americans to Eleanor Roosevelt and said, would you argue our case? Would you bring our case to the UN? And Eleanor Roosevelt said, let me take it back to not Theodore. Franklin, yes. Let me take it back to Franklin, and we'll see if we can do this. And Franklin said, bury it. Bury it. Put it under a pile and don't let anybody see it, because he didn't want to air American laundry on the international stage. And so Eleanor did. And so the human rights case, which includes not only civil rights and the political rights, the right to vote, and civil rights, the right not to be beaten on the street and the right to live, but it also includes the right not to be poor and the right to socialize with whoever you want, social rights. Those four quadrants of rights are included in the full spectrum of human rights. And this is what it requires to protect the image of God. The image of God in all of us requires the protection of our right not to be poor, because poverty eviscerates the capacity of people to exercise dominion in the world, right? The political oppression, not being able to vote, eviscerates the capacity of people to exercise dominion in the world through their vote. Civil, if you crush people's ability to get to go to a school, or you lock them in segregated schools, you eviscerate their capacity to flourish in the world. And the same is true with economic rights, right? So I think I said them all. So those are the four quadrants. But because Eleanor Roosevelt tabled it, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered her to, A. Philip Randolph was left with, well, what can we fight for just simply through our own court systems, since we can't bring it before the UN? And then they had to look at our own Constitution, and our Constitution only guarantees two of those four quadrants, and that's civil and political rights: the right to vote and the right to be, the right, all of those amendments that you've seen, the Bill of Rights. And so they began then the struggle for civil rights. It became a civil rights struggle. But toward the end of his life, Dr. King started to throw off that mantle and just say, you know what? We need to fight. We need to fight poverty. We need to fight for economic rights. We need to fight for the right not to be poor. Because, remember, he lived in, and they were in the midst of that time when nearly half of people of African descent were poor, were living under the poverty line. And we know we know it's possible. Johnson's War on Poverty, over the course of 10 years, just one decade, cut the poverty rate in half in America. Cut it in half. In 10 years. So we know what it takes. But very soon after that, when Nixon came into presidency, he shifted the war on poverty to be a war on drugs, which John Ehrlichman then admitted in 1995 and was reported in 2004, I believe, that war on drugs was really just a political war against Nixon's political foes, and those foes were black people and hippies.
Aw.
So he launched the war on
hippies.
drugs in order to be able to clamp down on those two communities and jail them to keep them from voting. And my family were victims of that war on drugs, direct victims. My uncle died of a heroin overdose in South Philly after heroin was pumped into that community. He was a songwriter. He actually has a song on the B-side of a record. I was like, what? Uncle Richie, what? But then he got addicted to heroin and all the kids, well, a lot of the kids who were out there singing doo-wop in the 50s and 60s dropped dead of heroin addictions and overdoses in the 70s. And then in the 80s, they pumped crack into our community in South Philadelphia. And my grandmother was beaten to death by a crack addict
Oh my God.
in 1991, 93.
Wow.
Oh my God.
So
Wow.
policies have consequences. There's a cost. There's real cost to the policies that we push and don't fight.
It's interesting. I was thinking about
I don't know if we can hear you.
stories that we don't
Yep.
tell. And now it seems like even the fight that's happening in academia at all levels to not tell some parts of the story, which of course then brings up the wonderful critical race theory.
Yes. Right.
And so I imagine 99% people who fight against critical race theory don't really know what it means. So one comment was, what you've described might be what critical race theory might even help us to see. How would you articulate kind of your strategy to address either critical race theory or at least even kind of what we're seeing today?
That's a really great question. In fact, I wrote a piece that is, it's not tongue-in-cheek, but the title is tongue-in-cheek, but it's actually really quite real, that my book is likely to be banned somewhere when it comes out in 2 days. It really is, because this is the story of how the law shapes whole people groups. And the entire theory. Let me tell you what critical race theory is in case it needs to be clarified. Let's just clarify that for a minute, okay? Because first of all, I've been teaching on this for now two and a half decades, nearly 3 decades, and training on it and moving communities through racial justice and racial healing. I never once read a book on critical race theory. I didn't even know what it was. I heard it whispered in corners when I was in very conservative evangelical spaces. People would say, "Isn't that critical race theory?" But it would just go kind of by the wayside. But last year, it really started to come up big when the Southern Baptist Convention, several of their presidents of their seminaries banned the teaching of critical race theory. So I was like, I better get a book on this and figure out what this is, right? So what is this thing? What is this? So, because the whole time, I just been learning it from the scripture, like literally. My text is the scripture. And so, but I found out, this is the theory, y'all. So it was developed in the 1970s by a man named Derek Bell, a professor, scholar out of Harvard. Derek Bell wrote many books, and one of them is called Faces at the Bottom of the Well, which I would highly recommend, right? So, and that one is actually written in the 1990s. But Derek Bell and a lot of others, a slew of other people, have been thinking about this theory, but it came out of law school classrooms. It is a legal concept. It is an academic concept, hence the word theory, right? Because anybody who lives race know it is not a theory. It's not a theory, it's fact. But it was direct, it was a theory that was born in direct response to the traditional way of thinking of American law at the time, which was it's all about money. I mean, or let's put it this way. The liberals were arguing that they needed to go towards Marx. Marx was going to be the savior, right? Marxian theory was going to be the savior of the universe. Well, Derek Bell said, no, No, it can't be, because Marx lives in an all-white world. And Marxian theory is economics in a petri dish that is all white. But America is not all white. And fundamental to American law, legal structure is this thing called race. So race actually is one of the, if not the, most critical element of American law that shapes American life. That's the theory. The theory is that race is a legal construct, a political construct that, and by political, what I mean by that, Honorable Raphael, right? So, is what I mean by that is it's the conversations that we have and the decisions that we make about how the polis will live together. It's really that simple, right? So, what he said was, this thing called race, it decides how the polis will live together. And it has. That's the theory, y'all. That's it. That's the theory. And it was revolutionary in the 1970s because they had not really done that thinking yet. But now we're like, duh, right? But now what they have been able to do is they've been able to take that acronym, CRT, and make it into a bogeyman.
Interesting. There's a great short story actually at the end of Faces at the Bottom of the Well called Space Traders.
Ooh.
That I recommend to folks, where folks from outer space come and they say, we have everything to solve all of your issues, but you have to give us your black people. And so the short story talks about that whole process of deliberation. So it's at the end of Faces at the Bottom of the Well. So I would really commend it to you. So I know we're getting close to time, so there's a few questions. I'll try to put them together, but they really are related to the work of decolonization. And maybe if you and maybe kind of our pastors can talk a little bit about kind of decolonization strategies.
Well, that's good.
And strategies that really address the undoing of white supremacy.
Yeah. I guess I can start with this very short thing, and then I'll pitch it over, hand it over. I have several. I'm connected with a network of indigenous theological scholars called the North American Indigenous Theological Institute. North American. It's NAATS, N-A-A. It's a North American, whatever, something like that. Indigenous. Sorry, forgive me for that. But NAATS is about 2 decades old, and they have been doing amazing, deep work in order to figure out what it looks like for them as indigenous people to decolonize their faith. So I'm following their lead. I follow their lead. And I want to encourage you to look them up. NAAITS, NAATS. And they are indigenous theological scholars from all over the world, actually now. They are in Australia, they're based in Canada, they're in North America, South America, Brazil, they're everywhere. A friend of mine named Randy Woodley is one of those scholars, and he wrote a book recently called Becoming Rooted. And I want to commend that book to you, Becoming Rooted, because that book sits on my bedside table. And it actually is a devotional. He wrote it as a devotional, so you can actually, but he takes you through the process of decolonizing your mind and your practices. And really, another word that you might want to become familiar with is re-indigenizing. Part of the depth of the problem comes from the uprootedness of us in America. We included, African Americans were uprooted from our indigenous selves, our indigenous rootedness to land. We've had to figure out a new way, a new culture, a new way of being. We are Creole people because we grab from all parts of who we are, and we have rooted ourselves now here. But it is indigenous practice that is a rooting practice, and indigenous people all over the world have very similar harmony ethics, is what he calls it, the harmony ethic, the ethic of, basically an ethic of love. So our the structure of our Congress is modeled after the Iroquois Confederacy, right? We thought that's a good idea. We need to actually do more of that. We need to be looking and asking the question, what can we learn from indigenous people that will reroot us? Because part of our problem is that we are unrooted. We are disconnected from ourselves because we are disconnected from the earth, from relationship to the earth, and also from each other. Said too much, go for it. Sorry.
I actually think it's a really complicated question, frankly, decolonization. So, my parents are from India, and part of the anti-colonial project has produced fascism, frankly. So we look at that critically as well, and that the tool towards delegitimizing us as Christians in India is that we are part of the colonial project, right? So it just complicates it in ways that we need to think about, and so I guess. In addition to what you've said, I think one of the things I would say is, I think one of the ways we decolonize is that we know the land that we're on. We're particular. We're particular about our bodies, whatever they are, our experience of our bodies. We are very rooted and particular about the ways that wonderful embodied practices are in our religious practice, and we claim those. And we're critical of things that try to remove us from our lived experience and our bodies, connection to one another, love for one another. And we keep that critical lens on it, that problematic frame can come out of any mouth and any body, frankly. That we got to listen for that and be very attentive.
That's good.
But that it feels extremely complicated to me, I have to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you take it to a global stage, that's true. It's very complicated.
And one part of it, and I think indigenous folks might talk about this differently, and that's not my experience, in India is we cannot be decolonized, really. We are so formed by generations of colonialism that we have to figure out now what is true into the future, what is right into the future. But we're not innocent, is the language I've heard. We don't get to be innocent.
Wow, that's good.
But
Well, this is hard work that we've had to do from the beginning. And I think about that church. I mentioned that the black church was born fighting for freedom. And that's the institutional church. But even prior to the institutional church, you have what we call the invisible institution. That is the church before there was a church. Lucretia Alexander, a former slave, talks about this in those testimonials that I think was collected in 1939. They had conversations, testimonials of former slaves. And Lucretia Alexander said that the master would send his preacher to us. And that preacher would preach every week from the same text, Ephesians, slaves obey your masters. And he would preach the same sermon. Don't steal your master's hogs, don't steal your master's chickens, do whatever your master tells you to do. She said later in the evening after the official church was over, we, quote, had a real meeting with some real preaching. And so there's this countervailing apprehension of the same text. So as Howard Thurman said, by some vastly creative spirituality, the slave undertook the redemption of a religion that the master had profaned in his midst.
Amen.
So we weren't simply converted to the religion, we converted the religion. Redeemed a faith that had been distorted in order to make us docile and obedient, transformed it into a liberating faith. And out of that tradition, Martin Luther King Jr. And Sojourner Truth and Fannie Lou Hamer, they come out of that tradition, but that work is ongoing. We have the same icon in the Heritage Sanctuary of the Ebenezer Church.
Wow. Yes, that's
And
right.
still Martin Luther King Jr. stands there and preaches a liberating faith. This stuff is complicated, y'all.
Yes, yes.
So it's ongoing work, and my answer to what we do, how do we respond to the project of decolonizing, is that we do have to be in conversation with the most marginalized members of the human family, whoever that is, in whatever context. So, so I have to push then the black church and say, how can you be the church born fighting for freedom and deny the ordination of women?
Right,
To
exactly.
ministry.
Yes.
Have an all-male diaconate? How can you be the church born fighting for freedom and marginalize and really malign our sisters and brothers, members of the LGBTQ plus community? If you're a freedom church, you're a freedom church.
Period. That's right.
And so the work of decolonizing is ongoing, it's tough. It points out the blind spots that all of us have, because we all sit in or I should say maybe not all of us, but there are ways in which we sit in relative places of privilege. Certainly all Americans sit in a relative place of privilege. There's certain things you can't see based on where you sit. And so, there are those, we have had to be pushed on the sexuality issue. The folk who are conversing in race, well, what about this? And they can live with that contradiction. We've had to be pushed. And the gospel text for me that's helpful for me in all of this, one of my favorite texts in the New Testament, in the Gospels, is the encounter that Jesus has with the Syrophoenician woman.
Yeah.
Because
Wow.
she's got a sick child at home, and that's what drives her. A sick child at home, and a mama with a sick child knows some stuff that other people don't know. And she wants something to be done for her child. First, the disciples, the church people, always in the way, telling her what's appropriate, shh, be quiet. And then when Jesus speaks, he says that it's not right to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs. Jesus said that.
Yeah.
And it's so striking that the whole history of commentary is us trying to wrestle with that. And it's so funny to read the commentators who say, well, he really didn't call her a dog. He said to the puppies. It's actually a term of endearment. Piece of advice, don't try it. Don't go home and try that.
Don't do that.
He's reciting the orthodoxy.
Exactly.
He's saying what he learned in seminary, if you will.
Wow. Wow.
And she pushes him, even the children. She's pushing him on the terms, still within the tradition, but pushing him. Even the children desire the bread. And she wins. Her daughter gets healed. Now, I'm a trained theologian, not a New Testament scholar, but I know enough New Testament from us being in seminary together to know that you can't really talk about the chronology, so it's not an easy. These are stories collected, told. I can't say with certainty what the chronology is, but my hunch, Don, is that Jesus encounters the Syrophoenician woman before he encounters the woman at the well.
Yes.
Because by the time he gets to the woman at the well, he has a broader view. And she's reciting the orthodoxy of who doesn't deal with who. And he's like, wait, there's something bigger than this. And so I think that the mother with the sick child helped Jesus to grow up. That's not something we used to hear in church.
Wow, yeah.
But for folk who need a scripture, and I understand that I'm from Pentecostal roots, I'm Pentabaptist. The Gospel of Luke chapter 2, verse 52 says Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and humanity. The question then is, what's the process of that growth?
That's so good.
I think she helped him to grow up. I think she helped him to become who he was. And maybe in our coming together in these ways, St. Luke's and Ebenezer, the Baptists, they say that, and the Episcopalians, they say the Episcopalians are Baptists who can read. We Baptists call the Episcopalian the chosen frozen. Maybe in that coming together across racial lines and all of these other lines that are constructs very often, we can help each other to grow up a little bit. That's my prayer.
So good.
Amen.
Woo! Yes.
I think Pastor Warnock has closed us off perfectly. Thank you all for this lovely afternoon. Lisa Harper is going to be available in the parish hall, which is just through this hallway, to sign some books. You will be among the first anywhere to have them, so get them before they're banned.
True.
Right back there.
So true.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Let's go sign some books.
Let me go take you back there, yeah.
Okay, yeah.